we're building, as you can see, bigger and larger companies. Exits like Taleo, first going public, second being acquired, is extremely important and good news for our tech ecosystem here in Quebec and even across Canada. Why? Because employees are going to be going out, building other companies. Investors start looking at our entrepreneurs with more enthusiasm and more faith that, hey, what's going to be the next company? Coveo, Acquisio, Stingray, Luxury Retreat, Beyond the Rack. These are companies that are driven by extremely strong entrepreneurs here locally wanting to build billion-dollar companies in our own backyard. Canada needs these type of entrepreneurs and these type of companies simply because a lot of the acquisitions that we've been looking at over the last few years are the sub-$100 million acquisitions. And the over $100 million acquisitions are right at the inflection point of the company, where the company, if with a little bit more drive and a little bit more capital and support, could have actually became, $500 million or billion-dollar companies. I think Louis actually outlined that, hey, Taleo actually went public 1 year too early. Well, these are all of the learnings that I think are extremely important for us in our network and how we're building out the ecosystem. I'd love to see across Canada and more in Quebec acquirers instead of only having acquirees, and we need more billion-dollar companies. But every single exit, I think we need to actually promote them, actually talk about them, provide more information about them, like today, these type of experience sharings, because it allows entrepreneurs, investors to basically want to do more, and it's very energizing. So thank you very much for your sharings and your experience today.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Louis. And thank you for you.
Thank you. There is now a big debate in Canada. Many people point out that we may sell our companies too early or shift them to the US too early, and then we, as you mentioned, Chris, we don't build large companies here in Canada or Quebec. So coming back to Taleo, could you explain, on the one hand, why Taleo, to a certain extent, had to become American to attract investors, to attract talent, to be closer to the markets? But it had positive effects here in Canada as well, because it still grew in Quebec City, and then wealth came back and talent came back. But anyway, it became an American company, and it has gone. Could things go differently? What do we need so that Taleo becomes a large company as it is, but still a strong Canadian company?
So I explained. It was all related to the capital raised. It's funny, we're raising around $15 million now in Coveo, and we're just at the beginning of this process. And it depends. Are we gonna go get it in Canada? If we do, then that's going to create a more Canadian environment. If not, then obviously we're courted by U.S. VCs and so on. U.S. VCs tend to be more aggressive. They move quickly on deals. They're not as sensitive. They look at the bigger picture. They put more fuel and et cetera. So we, as investors, just have to live up to that game. If we're going to compete, we need to compete with the same weapons, basically. And I'll give you an example. When we raised, Robert, you remember that, when we raised the C round at Taleo in 2000, our initial ask was $17 million. Bain Capital came back, they did their math, and they said, you know what, we did all the financial modeling and et cetera, we think you need 25. So that gives you an idea. Now, how often do we hear in Canada, here you go, here's a check of 8, and maybe we'll talk about the second tranche afterwards or so on. So that there's a difference, so we need to, if we want to keep companies in Canada, we need to keep the investors in Canada. That's the, and then, we need the investors to compete. And I have conversations with Canadian VCs. Some of them are good, some of them less good. And I happen to have conversations with US VCs as well. So I'm in a position to compare. And sometimes there is a difference. In the case of Taleo, I talked about the cross-border financing. Thank God this is solved. Ironically, it's an attorney from Boston who pushed the case, by the way, Steve Horowitz, who pushed the case for facilitating. Yeah, exactly. So that's the first thing. But regardless of that, when you think a company like Taleo, you end up with a shareholder base. So first of all, from an employee perspective, what I'm going to give you is a 2005 stat. I don't have off the top of my head the stat after that. 98.4% of our sales were outside of Canada. So we had 350 employees and still have in Quebec City, but we had 600 in San Francisco, and altogether 1,400 people across the world. So we have to be where our markets are. So from an employee perspective, even if we build big Canadian companies in the technology space, you have success if you're the #1 in the world. You need to be the best in the world at something, and that's the goal. And so, your employee base will be where your markets are. So it's more a question of investor than a question of employee base. At the end of the day, however, when you think about a Taleo, you end up with an investor base that is also partly Canadian. And so what you're doing is you're effectively creating value for those investors here. And to the extent that these investors, don't move their assets to the Bahamas or elsewhere, which my assets are here, and Charles is here, and Robert is here, et cetera, then that creates, more value, financially to be reinvested here. There's a third element that I think we often forget, is that when you invest and create companies here, you happen to hire people that suddenly are exposed to the international markets, and you import know-how by doing that, by some form of osmosis with rubbing against a competition internationally, and et cetera. And these people, in fact, there are a number of companies right now, little startups in the Quebec City region, that are former Taleo employees. One of them is Pedal MD. It's a network. It's a social network for doctors that I just invested in with Charles, in fact. And these guys are former Taleo employees. So that's also another benefit, that shouldn't be underestimated, I would say, of learning, how to build businesses and how these operations work, basically.
Building a critical mass.
Taleo could go one step further than Taleo did.
Of course, one reason that we had to look at the U.S. market for funding, because our fund was just a $75 million fund, so I went very fast from $2 million to $7.5 million, which was the maximum I could put into Taleo. So it was challenging on that side. But today it has changed pretty much. I think there's new fund on the like iNovia from with Chris Arsenault that has built a pretty good brand and now has a couple of $100 million on plate. So that's pretty good for us in Canada. But at that time, you have to remember that the funds were small. We couldn't put $25 million into a company like Taleo. So we definitely had to look at the U.S. market.
And by the way, that bar is raising. I don't know if you saw the recent IPOs in the U.S., Jive Software, Demandware, and those types of companies that trade at. Jive Software, I think yesterday was trading at about $1.6 billion of capitalization. That was 16 times revenue. So, I mean, the multiples are phenomenal right now. But you look at the amount of capital that went in that company before it went IPO. To create a $70 million revenue stream, $90 million of capital went into that. So that's the game. Are we up to it? I don't know, but that's the game.
Faut avoir les reins solides. Any other questions? Or we're good? Sorry. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.